Shocking footage just leaked. Meghan Markle slaps Givenchy staff in a heated outburst during Princess Charlotte's bridesmaid dress fitting. In a scene that's sure to send shockwaves through the royal family, a new video reveals Meghan Markle losing her composure at a Givenchy fitting under the watchful eye of Princess Kate's orders. What led to this stunning outburst, and why is the entire palace on edge? With tensions rising behind closed doors, this incident may reveal more than just a wardrobe malfunction. It's a sign of the deepening royal rift. Stay tuned as we uncover the hidden drama behind the Duchess of Sussex's explosive moment. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story opens on a day that should have been filled with joyful preparations, a day where tradition and elegance merged for a royal wedding, promising an unforgettable moment for the British monarchy. The meticulous planning had left nothing to chance, every flower chosen with care, every outfit tailored to perfection. Yet, behind the scenes, far from the grand entrance of St. George's Chapel, a conflict was brewing, one that would soon eclipse the day's anticipated bliss. In the heart of the royal quarters, where staff moved with hurried precision, whispers had already begun to circulate about a brewing tension between the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle, and the Givenchy team responsible for Princess Charlotte's bridesmaid dress. It was more than a clash of opinions, it was the clashing of worlds, a Hollywood spirit of independence against centuries-old royal decorum. For many, this tension was nothing new. Meghan had long been seen as the unconventional force shaking the palace foundations, but no one expected what would happen next. As the fitting day arrived, the atmosphere was taut, almost crackling with apprehension. It wasn't just the anticipation of the big day, but something deeper, a sense that the pressure had reached a tipping point. The Givenchy team, renowned for their craftsmanship and elegance, had been commissioned to create the dresses for the bridesmaids, including young Princess Charlotte. Under the guidance of Claire Wakekeller, the first female artistic director of the storied fashion house, the design was meant to reflect simplicity and grace, befitting a royal ceremony. Yet, the vision that was meticulously drafted in the Givenchy studios had somehow lost its harmony once inside the royal walls. Inside the spacious fitting room, the designers fussed over the finishing touches, tiny adjustments to the hem, careful smoothing of lace that glimmered faintly under the warm lighting. The quiet hum of sewing machines and the gentle rustle of fabric created a peculiar calm, one that sharply contrasted with the escalating tension as Meghan entered the room, flanked by a royal aide. Her face bore a hint of frustration, lips pressed tightly, eyes scanning the scene with a critical intensity. The staff, well accustomed to the stringent expectations of the royal family, braced themselves. Meghan's presence carried with it a gravity, a forceful determination that demanded immediate attention. She wasted no time before expressing her dissatisfaction. The dress, in her opinion, lacked the refinement she had envisioned. Her voice, though measured at first, carried an undeniable edge. One of the Givenchy seamstresses, visibly nervous, approached to explain the design decisions, pointing out the hand-sewn details that were the hallmark of the gown. But Meghan was unmoved. She insisted that the dress looked ill-fitting and creased, not up to the standard required for the historic occasion. There was a momentary silence, a vacuum in which everyone waited for the tension to dissolve, but instead, it grew thicker. In an attempt to mediate, the lead designer stepped forward, offering to make immediate adjustments. Yet, Meghan was already in full critique mode, questioning why such flaws had been allowed to persist. The Givenchy staff tried to reassure her that the dress would be perfect in time, but the Duchess was not appeased. Her frustration spilled over, her tone hardening as she reiterated that Charlotte's appearance must be flawless, reflecting not just the wedding's grandeur, but her personal standards as well. Then came the unexpected escalation, a moment that would become legendary among the staff. As one of the seamstresses bent down to adjust the hem, Meghan, in a sudden burst of anger, slapped the woman's hand away, telling her to stop touching the dress until the head designer was present. The room fell into stunned silence, the shock hanging heavy in the air. No one moved. It wasn't just the action itself, but the sheer disbelief that it had occurred at all, in a royal setting, where decorum was as sacred as tradition. Princess Charlotte, who had been quietly observing from a corner, looked up, eyes wide, clearly sensing the change in atmosphere. It was then that Kate Middleton entered, drawn by the unusual silence and the murmur of tension. Her presence, typically calming, seemed to intensify the situation. Seeing the distress etched on Charlotte's face and the trembling seamstress, Kate immediately took charge, her tone firm yet calm, directing the designers to continue their work without further interruptions. But Meghan, clearly agitated, was not prepared to back down. She challenged Kate, questioning her authority in the decision-making process. It was a subtle but pointed reminder that despite the Duchess of Cambridge's seniority, Meghan felt entitled to assert her own vision. Kate's response was measured, a reflection of her innate poise, but her words carried a weight that made Meghan pause. She reminded Meghan that the dresses had been chosen in consultation with both the bride and the design team, and any alterations would be made with mutual agreement. It was during this standoff that the royal nanny, unnoticed at first, recorded the scene. The small device was discreetly held, capturing the whispered arguments, the clash of opinions, and Meghan's sudden outburst. The nanny had always been protective of Charlotte, and seeing her caught in this whirlwind of adult discord stirred a protective instinct. She had witnessed the tension between Meghan and Kate on several occasions, but this was different, more volatile, more personal. The aftermath of the incident was chaotic in its own way. The Givenchy team retreated to make adjustments under Kate's supervision, while Meghan left the room, muttering about inefficiency and disrespect. In the days that followed, the tension continued to simmer, barely concealed behind the polished facade of royal unity. But within the palace walls, the whispers grew louder. Staff who had once remained neutral found themselves picking sides, divided between loyalty to the traditional values embodied by Kate and the disruptive change represented by Meghan. When word of the incident eventually seeped into the public domain, it was framed as just another chapter in the ongoing saga of royal discord. Yet, those who had been there knew it was more than a clash of styles. It was a window into the deeper conflict between tradition and modernity, formality and informality, duty and personal freedom. As the wedding day approached, tensions remained, but the dresses were finally deemed satisfactory. Charlotte, in her Givenchy gown, looked angelic as she walked down the aisle, unaware that her attire had sparked a battle that would leave lasting scars within the royal family. When the video clip held by the nanny surfaced months later, it was presented not as an exposé but as a quiet revelation, a glimpse into the struggles of two women grappling with the expectations of royalty. For Meghan, it was another controversy that fueled public opinion, while for Kate, it was a bitter reminder of the challenges in maintaining composure amidst chaos. The fallout from that slap, a fleeting moment of frustration, became emblematic of the tension that would ultimately redefine royal dynamics for years to come. It all began with a vision of perfection, elegance, and royal tradition that was supposed to be flawlessly reflected in the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. From the very beginning, it was clear that this wedding would be different. Meghan, an American actress with a flair for independence and a strong sense of personal style, was not content with merely following established customs. She wanted to redefine them, to leave her mark, and to do it on her own terms. This boldness was admired by some, seen as rebellious by others, but undeniably, it set the stage for a clash that no one could have predicted. The bridesmaid dresses were one of the key elements in the wedding planning. As tradition dictated, Princess Charlotte would be one of the bridesmaids, a role that came with not only public attention but also high expectations. The design of her dress became a point of contention that would eventually unravel into one of the most talked-about incidents behind palace doors. The dress was to be designed by Givenchy under the direction of Claire Wakekeller, who was personally chosen by Meghan for her modern sensibility and minimalist elegance. It was a choice that many saw as symbolic, a break from the royal tradition of British designers, a nod to Meghan's transatlantic roots and her preference for bold, contemporary fashion. From the outset, there were whispers of disagreements. Kate Middleton, the Duchess of Cambridge, had her own opinions about the bridesmaid dresses. As someone who had been through the pressures of a royal wedding, she understood not just the significance of the ceremony, but the expectations of the public and the tradition it represented. For Kate, the dresses needed to reflect a certain modesty and timelessness that aligned with the royal image. For Meghan, it was about standing out, about redefining what a royal wedding could look like in the modern world. The fittings were scheduled with military precision. Every detail was scrutinized, from the exact shade of ivory to the delicate lace trimming. The royal staff was accustomed to the demands of grandeur and tradition, but this time, there was an added layer of tension that simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the dresses, it was about control, influence, and the clash of two powerful personalities. Meghan's insistence on her vision was met with resistance from those who believed that tradition held the final say. The first fitting took place at Kensington Palace. Givenchy's team arrived early, their hands full of fabric swatches, sketches, and sewing kits. Princess Charlotte was brought in, her little hands clasped by the royal nanny, her eyes wide with excitement and curiosity. The Givenchy designers worked swiftly, measuring and adjusting, pinning the fabric carefully to ensure a flawless fit. Meghan arrived shortly after, her presence commanding the room instantly. She moved with a certain elegance that was unmistakable, every step deliberate, every glance sharp and observant. She examined the dresses with meticulous care, running her hands over the fabric, checking seams, and measuring hems with her eyes. At first, there were only minor adjustments, requests for tighter seams, softer lace, and a slightly altered neckline. The designers, accustomed to high demands, nodded and set to work. But as the fitting continued, Meghan's dissatisfaction grew. The lace, she said, did not sit right on Charlotte's shoulders. The hem seemed uneven, the fabric too stiff. Her voice, though measured, carried an edge of frustration that was hard to ignore. The designers attempted to reassure her, explaining that the final adjustments would be made in the days leading up to the wedding. But Meghan was insistent. "This is not acceptable," she remarked, her tone sharper than before. "It needs to be perfect. I want it redone." The Givenchy team exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the rising tension, but too professional to voice it. They continued to make adjustments, their hands moving swiftly and deliberately, but it was clear that Meghan's expectations were exacting. Kate arrived shortly after, her entrance calm and composed. She greeted the designers warmly and bent down to speak with Charlotte, who was now dressed in a sample version of the gown. Kate smoothed Charlotte's hair and adjusted the sleeves slightly, her hands gentle and practiced. For a moment, the room softened. Kate's presence had that effect, but it did not last. As Kate and Meghan began discussing the dresses, the atmosphere shifted once more. Meghan, still focused on the specifics, voiced her concerns about the fit and the design choices. Kate, in her characteristic calmness, suggested slight alterations, but reminded Meghan that the design had been approved by both of them weeks ago. "We agreed on this style," Kate said, her voice even but firm. "It's traditional. It's what the public expects." Meghan's response was immediate and resolute. "I understand tradition," she replied, her eyes fixed firmly on Kate's. "But this is my wedding. I want it to be perfect. I want it to reflect who I am." There was a pause. A silence that seemed to stretch uncomfortably. The designers kept their eyes on their work, hands moving steadily, pretending not to hear the clash unfolding just feet away. It was then that the nanny entered, holding Charlotte's shoes in her hands. She moved quietly, placing them near the fitting area, her eyes downcast as if trying to disappear into the background. But she could not escape the tension that had settled thickly in the room. The discussion between Meghan and Kate grew more pointed, their voices low but firm. Meghan's insistence was unwavering, her demands for perfection absolute. Kate, accustomed to the royal way of managing disagreements with grace and subtlety, maintained her composure, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of tension. The Givenchy team, sensing the rising conflict, attempted to mediate. They offered solutions, adjustments to the seams, alterations to the lace, but Meghan was not satisfied. She insisted that the fabric was wrong, that the fit was off, that the entire look was not what she had envisioned. Her words grew sharper, more clipped, and the tension escalated with each passing minute. At one point, Meghan reached out to smooth the fabric on Charlotte's dress, her hand moving quickly to correct what she saw as an error. The Givenchy seamstress, instinctively protective of her work, moved to adjust it herself, and that's when it happened. A slap, not hard, not violent, but enough to shock the room into silence. Meghan's hand had come down swiftly on the seamstress's wrist, a flash of frustration and impatience that none had expected. The room froze. Kate's eyes widened slightly, the designers paused mid-stitch, and the nanny, still holding Charlotte's shoes, seemed to grip them tighter. It was a moment suspended in disbelief, a breach of decorum so stark that it left everyone momentarily stunned. Meghan, realizing what had happened, straightened, her expression hardening with resolve rather than regret. She brushed it off as if nothing had occurred, directing her attention back to the dress, but the room remained heavy with shock. The nanny, ever watchful, had seen it all. Her hands tightened around the shoes she still held, and her eyes flickered with concern. This was more than just a disagreement over fabric and lace. This was a clash of wills, a collision of values that spoke to a deeper struggle. And she knew, without a doubt, that this moment would not be easily forgotten. The morning sun crept slowly over the sprawling estate of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across its manicured gardens and towering stone walls. Inside, the atmosphere was already charged with anticipation and tension. For the Givenchy team, this was not just another commission. Designing the bridesmaid dresses for Princess Charlotte and the other young girls in the royal wedding was a matter of legacy, a piece of history that would be forever immortalized in photographs and media headlines. It had to be flawless, not just for the Duchess of Sussex, but for the eyes of the world. Claire Waite-Keller, the first female artistic director of Givenchy, had been handpicked by Meghan Markle herself. For Meghan, Claire represented modernity and elegance, two traits she wanted to bring into the royal wedding. The decision had been somewhat controversial. Traditionally, royal weddings favored British designers as a gesture of loyalty and pride. Kate Middleton, for instance, had worn an Alexander McQueen gown designed by Sarah Burton, a decision that symbolized British craftsmanship and tradition. Meghan's choice of a French fashion house, despite Keller being British, was seen as a bold statement, a break from the norm, and an assertion of her own identity within the confines of royal expectations. The dresses for the bridesmaids were intended to mirror the simplicity and grace of Meghan's own gown, sleek lines, minimalist design, and an ethereal quality that would capture light and motion. Sketches were drawn up, approved, and materials were flown in from Paris, delicate ivory silk, organza, and lace sourced from the finest mills. Each dress was handcrafted by a team of experienced seamstresses who worked tirelessly to meet the exacting standards set forth by Keller and approved by Meghan. But as the weeks wore on and the wedding date loomed ever closer, whispers began to surface about the fittings. The Givenchy team had visited Kensington Palace multiple times, arms laden with garment bags and sewing kits, ready to make adjustments as needed. At first, the sessions were smooth, with only minor changes requested by Meghan. She was precise in her vision, directing the seamstresses to tighten seams here, smooth out lace there, and ensure that each dress fell in line with her modern, refined aesthetic. It was during one of these early fittings that Princess Charlotte was first brought in to try on her dress. The young princess, barely containing her excitement, twirled in front of the mirrors, her soft curls bouncing with each step. The Givenchy team smiled as they adjusted the fabric around her small frame, carefully pinning sections to ensure a perfect fit. Meghan watched intently, her eyes focused on every detail, occasionally stepping forward to inspect the stitching or the placement of the lace. She wanted perfection, and nothing less would suffice. However, there were murmurs of dissatisfaction from other corners of the palace. Kate, who had seen the dresses during a previous fitting, was concerned about the fit and style. She felt that the dresses were too minimalist, lacking the traditional elegance typically associated with royal bridesmaids. Her own experience with royal protocol had instilled in her a deep respect for tradition, one that she felt was being somewhat disregarded in Meghan's vision. Kate's concerns were voiced privately at first, a gentle suggestion to perhaps add more lace or a touch of embroidery to soften the starkness of the design. But Meghan, confident in her choice of designer and aesthetic, declined the adjustments, standing firm in her vision. The tension between the two duchesses grew steadily as the wedding date approached. The Givenchy team, caught in the middle of this quiet tug-of-war, did their best to accommodate Meghan's request while keeping Kate's suggestions in mind. It was an impossible balance, one that became increasingly strained with each fitting. For Meghan, this wedding was her grand entrance into the world's most famous family, and every detail had to be perfect, a reflection of her own taste and style. For Kate, it was a matter of upholding tradition and ensuring that the event reflected the dignity and grace expected of the royal family. As the final fitting approached, the Givenchy team prepared with meticulous care. Each dress was steamed and pressed, its seams reinforced, and its lace delicately stitched to avoid fraying. The seamstresses worked long hours, perfecting every inch of the dresses in anticipation of Meghan's critical eye. There had been whispers among the staff that Meghan's temper had flared during a previous fitting, a rumor that traveled swiftly through the palace corridors. Some dismissed it as mere gossip, while others nodded knowingly, recognizing the tension that had simmered just beneath the surface for weeks. When Meghan arrived for the final fitting, she was accompanied by an aide and two personal assistants. Her entrance was swift and purposeful, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. The Givenchy team stood in a quiet line, their hands clasped in front of them, waiting for her approval. Princess Charlotte, dressed in a soft ivory gown, stepped forward shyly, her small hands clutching the sides of her dress. Meghan's eyes swept over the ensemble, taking in every detail: the hemline, the lace work, the fit around Charlotte's shoulders. For a moment, there was silence as Meghan inspected the dress, her fingers brushing the fabric, her eyes sharp with scrutiny. Then, with a slight frown, she pointed to the lace at the shoulders. "It's not sitting right," she remarked, her voice measured but firm. The lead seamstress stepped forward, nodding as she examined the area. "We can adjust that, Your Grace," she said softly, motioning for her assistant to bring the necessary pins. Meghan watched as the adjustments were made, her arms crossed and her gaze unyielding. "I don't want any wrinkles," she added, her voice sharper now. "It has to be perfect. This is non-negotiable." The seamstresses nodded, their hands moving quickly and skillfully, smoothing the lace and adjusting the seams to Meghan's satisfaction. But there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that the expectations were almost impossibly high, that the pressure to achieve perfection had reached its breaking point. As the fitting continued, Kate arrived, her entrance far more subdued but no less impactful. She greeted the Givenchy team with her customary grace, her smile soft and genuine. When she saw Charlotte standing in her bridesmaid dress, her eyes sparkled with pride. But when she approached Meghan, the atmosphere shifted. Meghan's posture straightened, her expression firm, as if preparing for confrontation. Kate, always composed, simply nodded in approval of the dress, offering a few words of praise for the Givenchy team's craftsmanship. But Meghan's eyes did not soften. Her gaze remained fixed on the fabric, her hand smoothing out an imagined crease as if determined to find a flaw. The Givenchy team, sensing the unspoken tension, worked swiftly to complete the final adjustments. The seamstresses moved with precision, their hands steady despite the atmosphere thickening with unspoken words and lingering tension. It was as if the very fabric of the dresses absorbed the strain, the lace stretching under the weight of expectation, the silk taut with unspoken disagreements. When the final adjustments were made and the session concluded, the Givenchy team quietly packed up their supplies, their faces a mask of professionalism despite the palpable tension that lingered in the room. Meghan thanked them curtly, her eyes still scanning the dresses as if searching for imperfections. Kate, ever composed, simply smiled and led Charlotte out, her hand gently resting on her daughter's shoulder. But the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing day. Staff members spoke in hushed tones of the strained fittings, the moments of tension, and the subtle yet unmistakable clashes of authority and vision. The Givenchy team returned to their studio with stories of unyielding demands and impossible expectations. For them, it was a commission unlike any other, not just a dress, but a symbol of the silent conflict brewing within the palace walls. The room was draped in sunlight that poured through tall windows, casting elongated shadows on the polished floors of Kensington Palace's private fitting rooms. This was not the usual chaotic environment of fashion fittings. Instead, it was meticulously organized, with racks of ivory silk dresses lined up in perfect symmetry, each one carefully tagged and arranged. Mirrors stretched across the walls, reflecting the soft glow of chandeliers and magnifying every detail in the room. The Givenchy seamstresses moved quietly, their hands expertly navigating fabrics as they made the final adjustments to the bridesmaid dresses. Their fingers were swift and graceful, pinning seams and smoothing lace with the kind of care that only comes from years of experience. There was an air of quiet anticipation, the kind that lingers just before something significant is about to unfold. Princess Charlotte stood in the center of the room, her reflection bouncing off every mirror, multiplying her image into an endless sea of ivory. She was smiling, her hands clasped in front of her, her little feet occasionally shuffling as she adjusted to the feel of the gown. Her innocence was a stark contrast to the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Meghan arrived with her usual flair, flanked by two personal assistants and a senior aide. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she entered, her posture straight and her eyes sharp with purpose. She surveyed the room with a quick glance, nodding briskly to the seamstresses who greeted her with quiet respect. Her gaze landed on Charlotte, who stood obediently in her dress, turning slightly so the fabric caught the light. Meghan moved closer, her eyes narrowing as she inspected the fit of the gown. She circled around Charlotte, her fingers trailing over the lace shoulders and smoothing down the bodice. There was silence in the room, a heavy pause as the seamstresses waited for her verdict. Meghan's hands stilled, her eyes fixed on the hem of the dress. "This isn't right," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with a precise sharpness. The lead seamstress stepped forward, her hands clasped respectfully in front of her. "What seems to be the issue, Your Grace?" she asked carefully. Meghan's gaze didn't waver. The lace isn't sitting right on her shoulders, she replied. It looks messy. And the hem, it's uneven. This isn't acceptable. There was a momentary silence, a ripple of discomfort that passed through the seamstresses. They exchanged glances, and the lead seamstress approached Charlotte, bending down to adjust the lace with delicate fingers. I can fix that right now, she offered, pinning the lace tighter against Charlotte's shoulders. Meghan watched intently, her arms crossed, her expression unyielding. It should have been done right the first time, she remarked, her tone steely. We've been through this before. I don't want any mistakes on the day of. It needs to be perfect. The seamstresses nodded obediently, their hands working with renewed urgency. Meghan continued her inspection, pointing out tiny flaws, a slight crease here, a fold that wasn't sharp enough there. The Givenchy team adjusted each point she raised, their hands moving swiftly but carefully. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of fabric and the occasional whisper of pin lace. It was at this moment that Kate entered the room, her presence softening the sharpness that had hung in the air. She was alone, her steps quiet and unassuming. When she saw Charlotte standing in her dress, her eyes brightened with a mother's pride. "Oh, you look beautiful, darling," she whispered, crouching down to Charlotte's height and brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. Charlotte beamed, her small hands smoothing the fabric of her dress. Meghan, still standing with her arms crossed, watched the interaction silently. There was a tension that crackled between the two duchesses, a kind of silent understanding that neither would acknowledge openly. Kate straightened up, turning her gaze to the Givenchy seamstresses. "It looks lovely," she said, her tone warm and genuine. "Thank you for your hard work." The seamstresses smiled politely, nodding their appreciation, but Meghan's expression remained stoic. "There are still adjustments to be made," she interjected, her eyes still on the dress. "It's not quite right." Kate turned to her, her expression soft but firm. "I think it's beautiful," she said gently. "Charlotte looks perfect." There was a pause, the kind that stretches uncomfortably, filling the space with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Meghan's eyes flickered with a flash of defiance. "Perfection is important," she replied coolly. "We shouldn't settle for anything less." Kate's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in her posture, a straightening of the shoulders, a lift of the chin. It was subtle but noticeable. She moved closer to Charlotte, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's back. "It's a child's dress, Meghan," she said quietly. "It doesn't need to be scrutinized like a runway piece. Charlotte is happy, and that's what matters." The room fell silent. The Givenchy seamstresses stood still, their hands frozen in mid-movement, eyes darting between the two duchesses. Meghan's jaw tightened, her eyes locking with Kate's. "Happiness is important, yes," Meghan replied, her voice even. "But presentation is important too, especially on a day like this." Kate's eyes did not waver. Her voice remained soft but resolute. "I think she looks perfect," she repeated, her hand smoothing Charlotte's shoulder. Meghan's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes still sharp with determination. It was then that the senior seamstress, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward to make another adjustment to the lace. She moved with practiced grace, her hands careful and steady. But as she reached forward to smooth the fabric, Meghan's hand darted out, brushing the seamstress's hand aside. "I'll do it," she said curtly, stepping closer to Charlotte. The seamstress stepped back, her hands dropping to her sides, her expression stoic. Meghan adjusted the lace herself, her fingers working quickly and efficiently. There was a kind of tension in her movements, a tautness that belied her calm expression. Kate watched, her eyes soft but vigilant, her hand still resting on Charlotte's shoulder. When Meghan finally stepped back, she surveyed her work with a critical eye. "Much better," she remarked, nodding to the seamstress to continue. The Givenchy team resumed their work, their hands moving carefully, their eyes avoiding the two duchesses. Kate remained by Charlotte's side, her presence a steadying influence amidst the tension. There was a brief pause before she spoke again, her voice soft but pointed. "I'm sure it will be fine," she said quietly, her hand brushing Charlotte's curls once more. "After all, it's about the moment, not just the dress." Meghan's gaze flickered, but she said nothing. The room remained silent, the only sound the gentle swish of fabric and the click of pins being fastened. The Givenchy seamstresses worked with renewed focus, their hands deftly making the final adjustments, their eyes downcast, avoiding the palpable tension that lingered in the air. When the fitting concluded, the room emptied slowly, the seamstresses gathering their supplies and departing quietly. Meghan left without another word, her heels clicking sharply as she exited, her assistants following closely behind. Kate lingered for a moment, her hand still resting on Charlotte's shoulder, her eyes thoughtful. The Givenchy team packed up their materials, their faces expressionless but their eyes speaking of the strain that had unfolded. It was clear that this fitting had been more than just a matter of lace and seams. It had been a clash of ideals, a silent struggle for influence that had played out in the most unlikely of places. The day began with a familiar rhythm, breakfast in the royal nursery, followed by a gentle walk through the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace. Princess Charlotte loved these moments of calm, her tiny hands clutching the fingers of her nanny, who had been her constant companion since birth. The nanny, a woman of quiet strength and sharp instincts, had witnessed more than her share of tension behind the grand stone walls of the palace. Her position, though humble, granted her access to the most intimate moments of royal life, moments that were shielded from the public eye but spoke volumes about the true nature of those who wore the crown. The nanny, whose name was never uttered outside palace walls, had been trained for discretion. Her loyalty was unquestioned, her devotion to the children unwavering. But that day, something had shifted. The atmosphere was different, charged with a tension that simmered beneath polished smiles and carefully measured words. It wasn't the first time she had sensed it, but this time it felt heavier, more tangible. It began with hushed whispers between the palace staff, hurried glances exchanged in the hallways, and the subtle but undeniable presence of security guards stationed more closely than usual. The nanny took note of it all, her eyes keen and observant. She had learned long ago that nothing in the palace happened without reason, and every change, no matter how small, held significance. The fitting room had become the epicenter of tension that morning. The Givenchy team had arrived early, their hands full of garment bags and sewing kits, their faces carefully neutral. Meghan appeared shortly after, her stride purposeful, her expression sharp with determination. The nanny stood just outside the door, Charlotte's tiny hand still in hers, waiting for the signal to enter. She could hear the low hum of conversation, punctuated occasionally by sharper tones that carried through the heavy wooden doors. She knew the Duchess's voice. Knew the clipped edge that crept in when things weren't going her way. When the doors finally opened, the nanny led Charlotte inside, her steps light and practiced. She kept her eyes down, her face composed, but her ears were keenly tuned to the conversations unfolding around her. Meghan was standing near the mirrors, her hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke to the seamstresses, who nodded obediently, their fingers still working swiftly. Princess Charlotte stood quietly, her eyes wide and watchful, as if she too sensed the tension that threaded through the room. The nanny positioned herself near the back of the room, close enough to attend to Charlotte but far enough to remain unseen, unnoticed. She was good at this, disappearing into the background, blending into the silence. It allowed her to observe without being observed, to listen without being heard. It was a skill she had honed over the years, one that had served her well in the secretive corridors of royal life. It was during the final adjustments that things began to unravel. Meghan's dissatisfaction, which had simmered just below the surface for days, finally erupted. Her voice rose, sharp and unmistakably angry, as she pointed out flaws in the dress's design. The seamstresses moved swiftly, their hands working faster, their eyes downcast. But Meghan's frustration only grew, her words coming faster, more clipped, each one punctuated with a wave of her hand. The nanny watched silently, her eyes never leaving Charlotte, whose expression remained stoic but whose tiny hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress. It was instinct, pure, protective instinct, that made the nanny reach into her coat pocket and press record on her discreetly concealed device. She knew the risks, knew that capturing anything behind these walls without permission was grounds for immediate dismissal, possibly worse. But she also knew that what she was witnessing was different. It wasn't just a clash of personalities or a disagreement over lace and fabric. It was a window into something much deeper, much more troubling. The footage would later reveal the sharpness in Meghan's tone, the tension that hung thick in the room, and the silent compliance of those around her. It would show the seamstresses moving quickly, their hands trembling slightly as they made the requested adjustments. It would capture Charlotte's wide eyes, her hands smoothing the fabric nervously, her lips pressed tightly together as she stood quietly, too young to understand but old enough to sense the conflict. What it also captured was the moment Meghan's frustration boiled over. The Givenchy seamstress, a woman of delicate hands and years of experience, had been adjusting the hem of Charlotte's dress when Meghan's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You're pulling it too tight," she snapped, her hands reaching out to grasp the fabric. The seamstress stepped back instinctively, her hands raised in submission, but Meghan moved forward, her fingers brushing the woman's wrist aside with a flick of irritation. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those who weren't watching closely. But the nanny had seen it. More importantly, she had recorded it. A moment of tension crystallized in pixels and sound, a breach of decorum that no amount of royal public relations could fully erase. The room had fallen silent afterward, a vacuum of noise that was only broken by the gentle clearing of a throat and the soft whisper of fabric being adjusted once again. The nanny kept the device in her pocket, her hand resting over it protectively. She knew the implications of what she had just captured. It wasn't just about a fitting gone wrong. It was evidence of a growing fracture within the walls of Kensington Palace. It was proof of tension that could not be dismissed as mere rumor or speculation. But she also knew that the footage would have to remain hidden, at least for now. Its existence was a secret she would carry, a truth concealed behind her quiet smile and steady hands as she led Charlotte out of the room. In the days that followed, the nanny went about her duties with the same quiet efficiency, but there was a shift, a tension that lingered in her steps, a guardedness in her eyes. She kept the device locked away, hidden from prying eyes and curious whispers. Only she knew what it held. Only she understood the significance of that moment captured in silence and shadow. The palace carried on as it always did, the marble floors polished to a gleaming shine, the gardens manicured with perfect precision. But behind the doors of the royal nursery, the nanny watched over Charlotte with renewed vigilance. She had always been protective, but now there was a deeper purpose to her watchfulness. The footage, though hidden, served as a reminder that even behind the grand facade of royalty, there were cracks, fault lines that, if pressed hard enough, could shatter everything. The nanny never spoke of it, not to the other staff, not to her family, not even in whispers to herself. But she kept it close, a secret held in silence, waiting for the moment when the truth would need to be revealed. She knew that day would come. It always did. In the corridors of power and privilege, secrets never stayed hidden for long. The walls of Kensington Palace stood silent and imposing, their stone facades weathered by centuries of secrets and whispers. Inside, the atmosphere was unusually tense. Word of the incident during the bridesmaid fitting had begun to ripple quietly through the palace staff. Whispers traveled quickly from the sewing rooms to the corridors and into the hands of those who managed the household's most sensitive matters. But it was not until the account reached Princess Kate's ears that the real wave of consequence began to form. Kate was in her private quarters when she was informed. It was a soft knock at her door, gentle yet deliberate, the kind of knock that implied the news being carried was not meant for prying ears. Her personal assistant entered, her face composed but her eyes carrying the weight of something significant. Kate's expression softened, her hands pausing over the papers she was reading. "What is it?" she asked, her tone measured and calm. The assistant moved closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She recounted the events of the fitting, Meghan's dissatisfaction, the raised voice, the flick of her hand against the seamstress's wrist. There was no embellishment, no hint of gossip, just the facts as they had been relayed by those who had witnessed it. Kate's expression remained neutral as she listened, but her eyes hardened slightly, her posture straightening. She took a moment after the assistant had finished, her gaze drifting out toward the gardens beyond her window. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," she said finally, her voice steady. The assistant nodded, retreating quietly from the room, leaving Kate alone with the news that now weighed heavily in the silence. For a long while, Kate remained still, her fingers laced together in her lap, her thoughts turning over the events with measured precision. She knew the pressures of royal life, the strain of public expectation, and the weight of tradition. But this was different. This was not just a disagreement over dresses, it was a breach of respect, a crack in the veneer of royal decorum. It wasn't long before Kate made her way to the nursery, her step soft but purposeful. Princess Charlotte was there, seated at her tiny wooden table, coloring with a concentration only children possess. The nanny, who had been watching over her with quiet vigilance, straightened at the sight of Kate, her hands clasped respectfully. Kate smiled gently, moving toward Charlotte and smoothing a hand over her daughter's hair. "Hello, darling," she whispered, bending down to press a kiss to the top of Charlotte's head. Charlotte beamed up at her mother, her small hands gripping the colored pencils tightly. Kate turned her attention to the nanny, her expression softening further. "Can we have a moment?" she asked gently. The nanny nodded, stepping away to grant them privacy. Kate knelt beside Charlotte, her hand still resting on her daughter's hair. "Did you enjoy your fitting yesterday?" she asked softly. Charlotte nodded, her eyes still on her drawing. "The dress is very pretty," she replied, her voice small and sweet. Kate smiled, though the expression did not quite reach her eyes. "I'm glad to hear that," she said quietly. For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the doorway where the nanny had retreated. "Was everything all right, sweetheart? Did everyone treat you nicely?" she asked, her voice still soft but edged with a hint of concern. Charlotte paused, her pencil stilling over the paper. She glanced up at her mother, her eyes thoughtful. "There was some shouting," she replied finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aunt Meghan was upset. She wanted the dress to be perfect." Kate's hand stilled, her fingers brushing gently over Charlotte's curls. "Did that make you feel sad?" she asked gently. Charlotte considered the question for a moment before nodding. "It was very loud," she whispered. The ladies were very quiet after. Kate's expression softened, and she pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her close for a long moment. Charlotte relaxed into her mother's embrace, her small hands gripping the fabric of Kate's dress. "It's all right, darling," Kate murmured. "You did wonderfully. I'm very proud of you." After a while, Kate straightened, her eyes meeting Charlotte's. "If anything ever makes you feel uncomfortable, you must tell me, all right?" Charlotte nodded, her eyes wide and trusting. Kate pressed another kiss to her forehead, her hand lingering for a moment before she stood. The nanny returned shortly after, her expression calm and composed. Kate thanked her quietly, her voice steady and kind, before leaving the room with a new determination in her step. Her next stop was the east wing of the palace, where she knew Meghan would be attending a meeting with her team. Kate's stride was purposeful, her expression serene but resolute. She passed through the corridors with practiced grace, acknowledging staff with a nod but pausing for no one. When she reached the large wooden doors, she stopped briefly, composing herself before pushing them open with a gentle but firm hand. Meghan looked up, momentarily surprised by Kate's entrance. Her assistants glanced between them, their expressions carefully blank. Kate stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes meeting Meghan's directly. "Could I have a word?" she asked, her voice polite but unyielding. Meghan hesitated for only a moment before nodding, waving off her assistants, who left the room quietly, the door clicking shut behind them. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Kate waited until they were alone before she spoke. "I heard about the fitting," she began, her voice steady and composed. Meghan's expression did not change, her eyes remaining fixed on Kate. "I understand there were frustrations," Kate continued, her gaze never wavering. "But I need to make something very clear. That kind of behavior is not acceptable. Not with the staff. Not with anyone." Meghan's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression hardening. "I'm not sure what you've heard, but I was ensuring the dresses were perfect. That's all," she replied smoothly, her tone even. Kate did not flinch. "Perfect is admirable," she said gently, "but respect is mandatory. These people work tirelessly to make everything just right. They deserve to be treated with kindness." There was a pause, a silence that stretched thin and sharp. Meghan's gaze did not falter, her posture remaining rigid. "I expect high standards," she replied coolly. "I won't apologize for that." Kate held her gaze, unblinking. "High standards are important," she agreed, her voice still soft but firm. "But how you achieve them matters just as much. I won't tolerate any member of this family disrespecting the people who serve us." The room was silent for a long moment, neither duchess willing to break the tension. Finally, Meghan nodded, her expression still guarded but conceding nothing. Kate inclined her head slightly, her hands still clasped before her. "I'm sure we both want what's best for the family," she said quietly. Meghan's eyes flickered, but she nodded once more, her expression unchanging. Kate turned then, leaving the room with the same graceful stride she had entered with, her head held high and her posture unyielding. She returned to her quarters, her expression serene but her mind still turning over the conversation. It was not a confrontation she had wanted, nor one she had anticipated, but it was necessary. For her, for Charlotte, and for the staff who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. The tension lingered, unspoken but unmistakable, threading its way through the halls of the palace. Staff exchanged glances, whispers grew quieter, and the Givenchy team continued their work with heads lowered and hands quick. But one thing was certain, Kate had made her position clear, and her quiet strength spoke louder than words ever could. The walls of Kensington Palace held secrets like a vault, whispers trapped within corridors of stone and memories echoing off the gilded ceilings. For those who worked within its boundaries, discretion was not merely expected, it was required. A single misplaced word, a stray whisper, and livelihoods could be jeopardized. Yet, even under the weight of silence, whispers have a way of slipping through the cracks, carried by those who see far more than they are ever supposed to share. In the days following the bridesmaid dress incident, the atmosphere within the palace had changed. The usual hum of activity, the brisk footsteps of staff, the muffled conversations in private chambers, was replaced with something more subdued, more tense. It began with stolen glances exchanged between footmen, nods of acknowledgement between housekeepers, and murmurs in the kitchens. The royal staff, trained in discretion and loyalty, found themselves questioning the boundaries of their silence. At first, the whispers were vague, brief exchanges in the laundry rooms where maids folded silks and linens, hushed conversations in the back hallways where the gardeners gathered before sunrise. They spoke of tension, of raised voices during the fittings, and the unnerving silence that followed. Those who were present during the incident recounted the sharpness in Meghan's tone, the quiet compliance of the Givenchy seamstresses, and the swift movement of hands across ivory lace. It wasn't long before the story grew legs. Some claimed that Meghan's insistence on perfection had crossed the line from assertive to aggressive. Others whispered of a visible shift in Princess Charlotte's demeanor, her natural exuberance tempered by the tension she had witnessed. Still, most were careful to speak only in shadows, their voices never rising above a whisper, their eyes darting to ensure no one of importance was listening. For many, the incident had come to symbolize a deeper division within the palace, one that had been whispered about since Meghan's arrival. It wasn't just a matter of fashion or fitting. It was emblematic of a clash in values, of tradition versus modernity, of deference versus independence. Those who had served the royals for decades recognized the signs, the subtle shifts in power dynamics that often preceded larger storms. One housekeeper, who had been with the palace since the early days of Prince William and Harry's childhood, shared her observations with a close confidant during a rare moment of privacy. "I've never seen it like this," she whispered, her voice hushed and cautious. "Not even during the toughest days with Diana. There's a tension now. Like something's always waiting to spill over." Her companion nodded, eyes wide with concern. "Do you think it's true?" she asked. "About the fitting?" The housekeeper hesitated, her hands pausing over the linens she was folding. "I wasn't there," she replied carefully. "But I know those who were. They say it was unpleasant, unkind." The conversation paused as footsteps echoed down the hallway, sending both women back to their tasks with practiced ease. But the silence did not last. In the servants' quarters, where maids took their meals and footmen rested between shifts, the whispers continued. It was as if a dam had cracked, allowing fragments of truth to spill out in hushed tones and sidelong glances. The Givenchy team, too, found themselves the subject of careful inquiry. Their movements through the palace were now marked by subtle curiosity, maids who lingered a bit longer as they passed, footmen whose eyes lingered just a second too long. Yet the designers remained stoic, their faces masks of professionalism. They had worked for royals before. They knew how to carry themselves with grace under scrutiny. But even they could not fully hide the tension that crept into their shoulders or the slight tremor in their hands as they adjusted fabric and pinned seams. The royal nanny, who had captured the incident on her concealed device, became a figure of quiet intrigue. Her discretion was ironclad. She spoke to no one of what she had seen, her eyes never betraying the secret she carried. But her movements were observed with newfound interest. Staff members watched her more closely, noting the way she hovered just a bit nearer to Princess Charlotte during outings, the way her eyes flickered with a protective instinct that had not always been so visible. It was not long before these whispers found their way to the ears of higher-ranking officials within the palace. Word reached the senior aides, who gathered in quiet meetings behind closed doors, their discussions muted by heavy curtains and locked windows. There was concern, not just for the incident itself, but for what it symbolized. For a family that had built its legacy on restraint and decorum, the idea of internal conflict spilling into public view was not only unseemly, it was dangerous. Some of the aides had been around long enough to remember the fallout from previous royal disputes, how the slightest ripple of controversy had sent shockwaves through the media, threatening to destabilize the carefully curated image of unity and poise. This, they feared, could be the beginning of another such storm. Measures were discussed, decisions made in whispers and nods. It was agreed that the incident would be contained, managed with the same precision that governed every public appearance, every speech, every movement of the royal family. For the staff, however, the whispers continued. They spoke of unseen tensions between Meghan and Kate, of disagreements over protocol and style, of an undercurrent of unease that seemed to shadow every event, every public appearance. Footmen who served at royal dinners recounted moments of strained silence between the two duchesses, of glances that spoke volumes without a word being uttered. Some of the more senior staff, those who had been with the family for decades, took a more guarded approach. They had seen these things before: conflict and reconciliation, silence and resolution. But even they could not deny that this felt different. It was not just a clash of personalities, they whispered. It was a battle for influence, for control over the image of the monarchy itself. In the kitchens, where the clatter of pots and the hiss of boiling water masked conversations, the chefs and scullery maids shared their own accounts. They spoke of menus altered at the last minute, of special requests that seemed designed to assert authority rather than satisfy taste. "She's demanding," that one of the pastry chefs whispered, her hands dusted with flour. "Wants everything just so, and if it's not, you hear about it." Her companion, slicing vegetables with practiced precision, nodded in agreement. "Not like the Duchess of Cambridge," he replied quietly. "She's always gracious, never a sharp word. It's different with the new one. There's always tension." The whispers grew louder as the weeks passed, carrying the weight of speculation and truth in equal measure. The royal staff, bound by loyalty and discretion, continued their duties with professionalism, but behind closed doors, the conversations flowed freely. The palace, a symbol of grace and tradition, had become a stage for unspoken conflict, and for the first time in years, the walls themselves seemed to listen. The royal aides knew that something had to be done. Meetings grew more frequent, voices more hushed. Damage control was necessary, and it would have to be executed with precision and subtlety. Public appearances were scheduled, charitable engagements arranged to soften the image and redirect public focus. But behind the scenes, the tension simmered, held at bay by the iron grip of royal decorum. Yet even the thick walls of Kensington Palace could not fully contain the whispers. Not forever. And those who had witnessed the incident, those who moved in the shadows of the palace halls, knew that what had been seen could not be unseen. It was only a matter of time before the whispers grew too loud to ignore. The morning sun stretched its long rays over the stone walls of Kensington Palace, casting a pale glow across the manicured gardens. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but orderly. Royal aides moved with quiet urgency, their hands clutching files and documents, their expressions locked in a mask of controlled concern. Word of the fitting room clash had spread, not just within the palace walls but beyond them, seeping into the corridors of influence where whispers held the weight of truth. Something had to be done, and it had to be done swiftly. In a small, secluded office in the east wing of the palace, senior aides gathered around a polished wooden table. The air was heavy with unspoken tension as they exchanged glances, their expressions taut with the gravity of the situation. At the head of the table sat the head of communications, a man known for his unflinching loyalty to the monarchy and his uncanny ability to smother fires before they raged out of control. His hands were clasped in front of him, his eyes sharp and calculating as he surveyed the room. "It's gone too far," he began, his voice low but commanding. "The whispers are growing louder. We need to address this before it becomes unmanageable." His gaze shifted to the assistant at his left, a woman with meticulously styled hair and eyes that missed nothing. She nodded in agreement, her hands flipping through a stack of papers. "The staff is talking," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "If this isn't handled delicately, it won't just be whispers. It'll be headlines." There was a murmur of agreement around the table. They all understood the stakes. Kensington Palace had weathered storms before: scandals, leaks, the inevitable friction of family dynamics. But this was different. This was about respect, about treatment behind closed doors, about the image of the Duchess of Sussex clashing against the expectations of royal conduct. Damage control was no longer an option, it was a necessity. The head of communications leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the tabletop. "We need a statement," he said finally, his voice steady. "Something definitive, something that puts this to rest." He looked around the table, eyes scanning the faces of his aides, searching for consensus. There were nods, murmurs of agreement. But there was also hesitation, an unspoken fear that a statement might only stoke the fire. "What kind of statement?" one of the younger aides asked cautiously. "Do we deny it? Do we brush it off as a misunderstanding?" The head of communications paused, his fingers stilling. "We address it head-on," he replied, his voice firm. "We acknowledge the fitting. We express appreciation for the hard work of the Givenchy team. And we make it clear that any misunderstandings were resolved with grace and professionalism." He paused, letting the words settle. "We frame it as a testament to the commitment to excellence expected of a royal wedding." There was silence as the room absorbed his words, weighing the implications. Finally, the assistant with the sharp eye spoke up. "And what about the nanny?" she asked, her voice careful. "The whispers say she recorded it." The room fell silent, tension stretching taut across the space. The head of communications' jaw clenched slightly. "That is a rumor," he replied firmly. "And unless it becomes more than that, we do not acknowledge it. Our focus remains on the narrative we control." There was a pause, and then the shuffling of papers resumed, the room nodding in silent agreement. A statement would be drafted, carefully worded and polished to perfection. It would strike the right balance, diplomatic, reassuring, and undeniably royal. By the time the aides dispersed, the strategy was clear. Damage control would begin immediately, and the whispers would be snuffed out before they grew into something uncontainable. The statement was drafted with meticulous care, every word chosen for its weight and meaning. It began with gratitude, an acknowledgement of the hard work and dedication of the Givenchy team in preparing the bridesmaid dresses for the royal wedding. It spoke of the fitting as a moment of collective effort, a collaboration of ideas and adjustments to ensure everything was perfect for the historic day. It described the process as an example of the meticulous planning and attention to detail expected for such a grand occasion. But it was the final lines that carried the true weight of the message. "We recognize the commitment and craftsmanship displayed by all those involved and appreciate the patience and understanding exhibited during what is always a high-pressure period leading up to such a significant event. Any misunderstandings were resolved with grace and professionalism, reflecting the unity and strength of our family." The statement was released quietly at first, a subtle announcement to the press, an email sent to key media contacts. There was no grand press conference, no parade of cameras or microphones. It was the palace's way, controlled, measured, perfectly orchestrated. The hope was that the whispers would die down, suffocated under the weight of official narrative. But inside the palace, the whispers did not fade. The Givenchy team continued their work with the same professional grace, but there was a new tension in their hands as they stitched and sewed. Among the staff, conversations grew quieter but did not stop. The nanny moved through her daily routine with silent efficiency, her eyes always watchful, her secrets kept close. It was in the servants' quarters that the real conversations happened. Over cups of tea in the early morning hours, between shifts and duties, the whispers grew bolder. Some spoke of the recording as if it were a legend, others as if it were undeniable fact. The nanny never spoke of it, her silence only deepening the mystery. But those who knew her best saw the slight change in her posture, the way she hovered a bit more protectively over Princess Charlotte, the way her eyes seemed to always be searching for something unseen. For the senior aides, the statement was deemed a success. The headlines were brief and controlled, the narrative held tightly within the palace's grasp. But they also knew that silence did not mean disappearance. The rumors would not vanish. They would only go quiet, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It was a matter of control, and control was something the palace understood well. The Duchess of Cambridge, meanwhile, maintained her usual grace, attending events with her head held high, her smile warm and unyielding. Meghan did the same, her public appearances polished and poised, her hand resting gently on Harry's arm. To the world, everything seemed serene, an image of unity and elegance that reflected the monarchy's unbreakable tradition. But inside the walls of Kensington Palace, the whispers continued. Among the staff, the Givenchy seamstresses, the footmen, and the nannies, the stories lingered. They spoke of the fitting, of the sharpness in Meghan's tone, of the seamstress's pale face and trembling hands. And always, the whispers returned to the nanny, to the secret she carried, hidden away and unspoken but very much alive. The palace had crafted its narrative, pressed its version of the truth into the hands of the media, and silenced dissent with the force of tradition. But there were those who knew better, who had seen more than they were ever meant to see. And though their voices were hushed, they were not gone. Not yet. The walls of Kensington Palace had long been accustomed to silence. Its stone corridors and grand halls had witnessed whispers of scandal and tension throughout the generations, but they held their secrets tightly. Until now. The aftermath of the bridesmaid dress fitting had sent ripples through the palace walls, unsettling the delicate balance that had existed between Meghan and Kate. What began as a mere disagreement over fabric and lace had erupted into something far deeper, a rift that no amount of royal protocol could mend. It started subtly. The public appearances, once filled with polite smiles and exchanged glances, now felt strained. During royal engagements, Meghan and Kate maintained their practiced grace, but those who watched closely could see the fissures. Where once they stood side by side, their shoulders angled toward one another, there was now a calculated distance. Photographs captured their smiles, but not the tension behind their eyes. It was evident in the stiffness of their posture, the slight turn of their bodies away from each other, as if even proximity had become a chore. Inside the palace, the staff took note. Footmen and maids exchanged quiet glances as the duchesses passed by, their footsteps echoing in opposite directions down the hallways. The atmosphere had changed. There was a chill that settled over the East Wing, where Meghan and Harry resided, a kind of quiet isolation that had not existed before. Meanwhile, Kate's quarters remained bustling with activity, filled with the warmth of children's laughter and the steady hum of routine. For Kate, the fitting incident had left more than just a sour taste. It had left questions. Questions about behavior, about respect, and about the dynamics that were quietly shifting within the royal family. She confided in William, who listened patiently as she recounted the events with a calmness that belied the tension beneath the surface. He understood the pressures of royal life, but there was a line that had been crossed, one that could not be ignored. Meghan, too, had her own perspective. To her, the incident was emblematic of the rigid expectations she had been forced to navigate since joining the royal family. She saw Kate's intervention not as an act of protection, but as a subtle assertion of authority, a reminder of her place within the hierarchy. It was a hierarchy she had never fully embraced, one that she had been quietly resisting since the beginning. The public began to speculate. Tabloids ran headlines hinting at tension between the duchesses, their covers splashed with images of the two women captured mid-stride, their eyes cast away from one another. Pundits dissected their interactions with obsessive detail, noting the moments when they failed to make eye contact or stood just a bit too far apart during public events. Speculation grew louder, feeding off whispers from palace insiders who spoke anonymously of growing animosity and whispered conflicts behind closed doors. The tension was not lost on the Queen. Elizabeth had always maintained an ironclad grip on the image of unity within the family, knowing that public perception was a pillar of the monarchy's strength. She summoned both duchesses to a private meeting at Buckingham Palace, a rare and calculated move meant to smooth over tensions before they spilled into the public domain. The meeting was held in the Green Drawing Room, its walls lined with portraits of former monarchs who had weathered their own storms with stoic resilience. The room was chosen for its privacy and its symbolism, a reminder of the legacy they were upholding. Kate arrived first, her expression composed, her hands clasped in front of her. Meghan followed shortly after, her stride confident, her gaze steady. The two women exchanged polite nods, but the distance between them was palpable. The Queen entered moments later, her presence filling the room with an unspoken authority. She moved gracefully to the head of the room, her gaze settling on both women with a measured calmness. "I understand there have been difficulties," she began, her voice firm but not unkind. "Differences of opinion are natural, but unity is imperative. We are a family. More importantly, we are a symbol of strength and solidarity. This tension must be resolved." Meghan was the first to speak, her voice calm but resolute. She explained her perspective, her desire for things to be perfect, her insistence on standards that reflected the importance of the day. Kate listened in silence, her expression impassive, her hands still clasped neatly in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, she chose her words carefully, her tone measured. She spoke of respect, of kindness, and the importance of understanding the weight of their roles, not just for themselves, but for the institution they represented. The Queen listened without interruption, her gaze shifting between the two women as they spoke. When silence fell, she nodded once, her expression thoughtful. "Perfection is admirable," she said quietly, "but grace is essential. We do not simply represent ourselves, we represent a legacy." Her eyes met Meghan's. "This family is stronger together. I trust you both understand the importance of unity." The meeting concluded with polite farewells, but the rift remained. It was deeper than a mere disagreement over a dress. It was a clash of values, of upbringing, of expectations that neither woman was willing to relinquish. And though both left the room with smiles for the cameras that waited outside, the distance between them had solidified. Inside the palace, the whispers grew louder. Staff spoke in hushed tones of the strained silence that followed the Queen's intervention, of the way Meghan retreated to the East Wing and Kate returned to her quarters with a quiet resolve. The Givenchy team continued their work, their hands moving over fabric with renewed urgency, their expressions guarded. And the nanny, who still held the footage in secret,